You love your cat. That's not in question. You watch over them. You protect them. You offer affection in the ways you know how. And because of that love, it's easy to assume that the things you do every day must be good for them. But what if some of those gestures, the quiet ones, the gentle ones, are doing something very different on the inside? What if your cat isn't resisting, not because they enjoy it, but because they've learned to endure it? Cats are not dramatic when they're uncomfortable. They don't protest loudly. They don't always pull away. Instead, they go quiet. They still their bodies. They adapt. And that silence is often mistaken for consent. Today, we're exploring the silent behaviors that may be hurting your cat, even when you believe you're showing love, not to blame, not to accuse, but to understand what your cat has never learned how to say. Stillness is not comfort. One of the most misunderstood signals in cats is stillness. When you pick your cat up, when you hold them close, and they don't struggle, don't squirm, don't try to escape, it feels like trust. And sometimes it is. But just as often, it's something else entirely. Cats freeze when they feel overwhelmed. Not because they feel safe, but because movement feels riskier than entrance. In the wild, stillness is survival. Drawing attention is dangerous. Resistance can escalate a situation. So when your cat goes limp in your arms, lowers their ears slightly, tightens their jaw just a little, they may not be relaxing. They may be shutting down. Over time, repeated moments like this teach your cat a quiet lesson. Affection is something to tolerate, not enjoy. And the most painful part, they don't associate that discomfort with anger toward you. They associate it with closeness itself. Tolerance is not enjoyment. Cats are incredibly good at adapting to the environments they're placed in. When something makes them uncomfortable, but happens repeatedly, they don't always fight it. They learn to tolerate it. This is where many well-intentioned owners get confused. Your cat lets you touch their belly. They allow kisses on the head. They stay nearby when you're loud, emotional, or overstimulated. And because they don't leave, you assume they enjoy it. But tolerance and enjoyment are not the same thing. A cat that enjoys something leans into it. Their body softens. Their breathing slows naturally. A cat that tolerates something simply waits for it to end. Their muscles stay slightly tense. Their tail may flick just enough to be missed. Their eyes blink slower, not in comfort, but in restraint. Over time, tolerance can quietly erode trust. Not because you're cruel, but because your cat learns that their boundaries are invisible. And when boundaries go unseen for long enough, cats don't push harder. They retreat inward. Staying close doesn't always mean feeling safe. Many people believe proximity equals comfort. If my cat stays near me, they must feel safe. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes staying close is a strategy, not a preference. Cats are territorial animals. When they feel unsure, they anchor themselves to what's familiar. That familiar thing might be you. So your cat stays on the couch beside you, sleeps at the foot of your bed, follows you from room to room, and it feels like love. But watch closely. Are they relaxed or vigilant? A cat that feels truly safe doesn't constantly monitor your movements. They don't flinch when you stand up. They don't reposition every time you shift. When closeness is driven by anxiety, your cat isn't bonding, they're managing uncertainty. And if the same behaviors that soothe you are the ones increasing their alertness, that closeness can quietly become exhausting for them. Love to a cat is not about distance or attachment. It's about predictability. And when predictability disappears, even closeness can hurt. When your cat stops saying no. One of the most dangerous moments in a cat's emotional life is not when they hiss, scratch, or run away. It's when they stop doing all of that. A cat that clearly says no is still communicating. They still believe their signals matter. But when those signals are ignored, when pulling away doesn't change anything, when subtle warnings are brushed off as nothing, cats adapt by conserving energy. They stop escalating, not because they're okay, but because resistance has proven useless. This is often mistaken for maturity. They've calmed down, they've grown out of it, they're just more relaxed now. In reality, some cats haven't relaxed at all. They've learned that saying no comes at a cost, and so they go quiet. This silence doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly through small moments, being held a second too long, touched after turning away, interrupted when they were finally settling into comfort. Over time, your cat learns something subtle and painful. Their discomfort is invisible. And once a cat stops expressing boundaries, the emotional distance begins, even if they're still physically close. Affection on your terms, not theirs. Love feels universal to us. We assume affection works the same way across species, that closeness, touch, and attention are always positive. But cats don't experience affection as a constant need. They experience it as a choice. When affection happens on their terms, it strengthens trust. When it happens on yours, repeatedly, predictably, without pause, it becomes pressure. This doesn't look dramatic. Your cat may still approach you, still rub against your legs, still accept touch, but the moment affection shifts from invitation to expectation, something inside them tightens. Cats communicate consent in very quiet ways: a pause, a turn of the head, a subtle shift of weight. When those signals are missed, your cat doesn't feel unloved, they feel unheard, and over time, affection that once felt safe becomes something they brace for. Not because you meant harm, but because love, when it doesn't allow choice, stops feeling like love to them. Emotional withdrawal looks like independence. Cats are often praised for being independent. When they stop asking for attention, stop following you as closely, stop reacting to your presence the way they once did, it's easy to interpret that as confidence. They're just more secure now. They don't need me as much. But emotional withdrawal and independence can look identical on the surface. The difference lies in motivation. An emotionally secure cat explores. They initiate interaction. They return to you freely. A withdrawn cat conserves energy. They limit exposure. They stay neutral to avoid friction. When affection has repeatedly felt overwhelming, some cats don't fight it. They reduce themselves. They interact less. They ask for less. And from the outside, this quiet shrinking can look like calm. But inside, it's often resignation. The painful irony is this: the more your cat withdraws, the more you might assume they're fine. And the less likely you are to notice that something has been lost. Calm can be a coping strategy. Not all calm is peace. Sometimes calm is control. When a cat learns that emotional reactions don't change outcomes, they regulate by becoming still, predictable, and reactive. This is not trust. It's coping. A coping cat limits emotional expression because expression hasn't felt safe or useful. They move less. They vocalize less. They ask less of the world. And because nothing appears wrong, their inner experience goes unnoticed. But emotional suppression doesn't disappear, it settles. Over time, this can show up as less play, reduced curiosity, shorter bursts of engagement. Not because your cat is aging or changing naturally, but because they've adapted to a version of love that doesn't always hear them. Calm, in this sense, is not contentment. It's survival. Understanding instead of guilt. If you've recognized yourself in any of these moments, pause here for a second. This isn't about blame. It's about awareness. The truth is, most cats are not hurt by cruelty. They're hurt by misunderstanding, by love that doesn't quite speak their language. And that misunderstanding is incredibly common because cats don't demand to be understood. They adapt. They soften their signals. They quiet their protests. They learn to live inside the spaces we give them. What makes this painful and that we get things wrong? It's that we often don't realize we can do better until someone slows the moment down and points to what we've been missing. Your cat has never needed perfection from you. They don't measure love by how much attention you give, how often you touch them, or how closely you keep them near. They measure love by how safe it feels to be themselves around you, by whether they can say yes, and just as importantly, whether they're allowed to say no. The quiet truth is this: cats don't pull away when they feel respected. They return freely, slowly, on their own terms. And when you begin to notice the small pauses, the subtle shifts, the moments when stillness is not relaxation but restraint, something changes. Not just in your cat, but in the relationship itself. Because love to a cat is not something that happens to them. It's something they choose. If this video helped you see your cat differently, consider supporting the channel with a like. Subscribe if you want to understand animals beyond behavior and into the quiet emotional worlds they live in. And if you've ever realized, even for a moment, that love sometimes needs to listen more than it touches, leave a comment. Your experience might help someone else notice what they've been missing. Thank you for taking the time to watch and for caring enough to look closer.